Picture this, the most powerful room in America. Marble columns reaching toward vaulted ceilings like ancient temples of democracy. Every seat filled. Every camera rolling. The air so thick with tension you could cut it with a knife. It's a Tuesday morning that will be remembered forever. The Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room buzzes with the electricity of history in the making. Reporters lean forward in their seats. Staffers clutch their phones. The nation watches. And then it happens. Senator Josh Hawley, that perfectly coiffed embodiment of Yale Law privilege, leans into his microphone with that trademark smirk. The same smirk he's worn while dismissing women colleagues for years. The same condescending expression that says he knows better than half of America about their own bodies. "Well, Madam Vice President," he drawls, his voice dripping with mock politeness, "I think you're being a bit dramatic about constitutional rights here. Women have plenty of protections already, and frankly." He doesn't get to finish. Vice President Kamala Harris raises her hand. Not dramatically. Not theatrically. Just a simple, authoritative gesture that somehow commands the entire room to freeze. Her dark eyes lock onto Hawley's with the precision of a prosecutor who's dismantled bigger men than him. The silence is deafening. "Senator," she says, her voice steady as steel, measured as a heartbeat, "I'm speaking. 4 words. That's all it takes." Hawley's smirk falters. Just for a second, but the cameras catch it. The whole world catches it. In that micro-moment, something shifts in the cosmic balance of American politics. The mansplainer has met his match. The room holds its collective breath. Seasoned reporters who've covered decades of political theater sit up straighter. This isn't just another Senate hearing. This is the moment when preparation meets privilege, when dignity stares down arrogance, when a daughter of immigrants reminds a son of elite America exactly who belongs in this chamber. Harris doesn't blink. Doesn't waver. She simply continues, and with each word that follows, she's not just speaking to Hawley. She's speaking to every woman who's ever been interrupted, dismissed, or told to quiet down while men decided their fate. What happens in the next 47 minutes doesn't just go viral. It rewrites the playbook on how power responds to arrogance in America. But to understand how this single exchange exposed the soul of American politics, we need to go back to where it all began. This wasn't just another Tuesday morning hearing that would disappear into C-SPAN archives. This was the hearing that would define a generation. 3 months earlier, the Supreme Court had dropped a bombshell that shattered 50 years of precedent. Roe versus Wade, gone. With the stroke of a pen, the highest court in the land had ripped away constitutional protections that millions of American women had counted on their entire lives. The shockwaves were still reverberating across every state, every dinner table, every voting booth in America. From coast to coast, the streets had erupted. In Washington, a sea of pink hats flooded the National Mall. In Texas, women marched with coat hangers raised high, a haunting reminder of the dark days America thought it had left behind. In Florida, mothers clutched their daughters' hands as they protested outside state capitals. The images burned into the national consciousness, grandmothers who remembered the time before Roe standing shoulder to shoulder with teenagers who never imagined they'd have to fight for rights their mothers took for granted. But protests weren't enough. The real battle had to be fought in the halls of power, where old men in expensive suits made decisions about women's bodies with the casual indifference of ordering lunch. That's what brought America to this moment. The Senate Judiciary Committee hearing on constitutional protections and reproductive freedom, words that sounded clinical but carried the weight of every woman's future. The hearing room had become ground zero for the fight over who gets to control women's lives in America. The numbers told the story of a nation transfixed. Over 12 million Americans were watching live across all platforms. Twitter was exploding with hashtags. Instagram stories multiplied by the thousands. TikTok creators were already preparing their hot takes. This wasn't background noise, this was appointment television for anyone who cared about the direction of American democracy. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Republican senators, emboldened by the Supreme Court's decision, saw this as their moment to cement a new era where state governments could strip away women's rights with impunity. They came prepared with talking points about states' rights and constitutional originalism, comfortable in their certainty that they held all the cards. On the other side sat the Democrats, desperate to find some path forward in a landscape that had shifted beneath their feet overnight. But more than political calculus was at play here. This was about the lived reality of millions of women who woke up one morning to discover they had fewer rights than their mothers. Vice President Harris wasn't just another Democratic voice in this fight. As the highest-ranking woman in American history, she carried the hopes of every little girl who'd ever been told she could grow up to be anything. But she also carried something else, the weight of knowing that her presence in that chair represented both how far America had come and how far it could still fall. The viewing numbers kept climbing. 12 million became 15 million. Social media engagement reached fever pitch. America was watching because they sensed that something fundamental was about to happen. This wasn't going to be another hearing where politicians read prepared statements and nothing changed. What happens in the next 47 minutes doesn't just go viral, it reshapes the entire conversation about women's rights in America. But first, you need to understand exactly who Josh Hawley thought he was dealing with. Josh Hawley didn't just stumble into that Senate hearing room. He walked in carrying 42 years of privilege like a perfectly tailored suit, convinced that his Ivy League credentials and boyish charm could smooth over any rough edges in American politics. This is a man who's never met a mirror he didn't like or a woman he couldn't patronize. Born into comfort in suburban Kansas City, Hawley's path was paved with gold from day one. Private schools where questioning authority was discouraged and entitlement was taught as curriculum. Stanford University, where he learned to package his conservative views in academic language that sounded reasonable to donors. Yale Law School, where he polished his ability to speak down to people while maintaining plausible deniability about his condescension. But here's where it gets interesting. Hawley didn't just coast through Yale, he clerked for Chief Justice John Roberts. Think about that for a moment. This man spent a year learning the inner workings of the Supreme Court, watching how 9 justices shaped the constitutional rights of 300 million Americans. He saw power up close, and more importantly, he learned how to wield it. After his clerkship, Hawley crafted what political consultants call the perfect narrative. The Missouri boy who went to fancy schools but never forgot his roots. The constitutional scholar who fights for the common man. The young family man who stands up to coastal elites. It was political theater at its finest, and it worked like a charm. But scratch beneath that carefully constructed surface, and you'll find something much uglier. Ask any woman who's worked with Josh Hawley, and they'll tell you the same story with minor variations. The interruptions that always seem to happen when a female colleague is making a crucial point. The way his smile never quite reaches his eyes when he's explaining why a woman's perspective might be a bit emotional for serious policy discussions. The casual dismissiveness dressed up as Midwestern politeness. During his time as Missouri Attorney General, female staffers whispered about meetings where Hawley would nod thoughtfully at women's contributions, then immediately turn to the nearest man and ask, "But what do you think about this issue?" It became such a pattern that some women started bringing male colleagues as backup, knowing their ideas would only be heard if they came from masculine voices. His Senate colleagues know this dance well. Senator Elizabeth Warren once described trying to speak with Hawley about banking regulations as, like explaining calculus to someone who keeps asking if you've tried using a calculator instead. Senator Amy Klobuchar, after one particularly frustrating Judiciary Committee session, was overheard telling staff that Hawley had the unique ability to mansplain constitutional law to a former prosecutor while looking like he was doing you a favor. But Hawley's greatest skill isn't legal analysis, it's reading rooms and calculating exactly how much condescension he can get away with before people start noticing. He's mastered the art of the political dog whistle, saying things that sound reasonable to his base while sending unmistakable messages to anyone paying closer attention. When women's rights advocates criticized his positions on reproductive freedom, he responded with that trademark smirk and a patronizing, "I understand emotions are running high, but we need to focus on constitutional principles here." When pressed about his voting record on women's issues, he'd flash that boyish grin and explain that he was just trying to protect women from policies that might harm them in the long run. The pattern was so consistent it became predictable. Hawley would enter every confrontation with women politicians absolutely certain of two things: first, that his Ivy League credentials gave him intellectual superiority, and second, that his carefully practiced charm could smooth over any offense he might cause. This confidence had served him well throughout his career. Missouri voters bought the populist act. Republican donors loved the constitutional scholar persona. Conservative media ate up his ability to deliver soundbites that sounded principled while advancing deeply partisan agendas. Walking into that hearing room, Hawley was riding high on a string of political victories and Supreme Court wins that had vindicated everything he believed about power, gender, and his own righteous place in American politics. He saw an opportunity to score more points with his base by putting the vice president in her place with some good old-fashioned constitutional lecturing. Little did Hawley know, he was about to face a prosecutor who had spent decades dismantling men exactly like him. Kamala Devi Harris learned to fight before she learned to walk. Not literally, of course, but in the Oakland apartment where she spent her early years, resistance was as much a part of daily life as breakfast cereal. Her mother, Shyamala Gopalan, had traveled 8,000 miles from Chennai, India, to pursue her doctorate in nutrition and endocrinology at UC Berkeley. Her father, Donald Harris, had journeyed from Jamaica to study economics at the same university. Two brilliant minds from opposite ends of the world, united by ambition and an unshakable belief that their daughter could become anything America would allow her to be. But Shyamala Harris didn't just teach her daughter to dream big, she taught her to fight smart. Don't sit around and complain about things, Shyamala would tell young Kamala. Do something. It wasn't just motherly advice, it was a battle cry from a woman who had broken through every barrier placed in front of her. Here was a single mother raising two daughters while conducting groundbreaking breast cancer research, publishing in prestigious journals, and refusing to let anyone, including her own colleagues, diminish her contributions because of her accent or her gender. Kamala watched her mother navigate faculty meetings where men would interrupt her presentations, then calmly redirect the conversation back to her research with surgical precision. She saw how Shyamala would prepare twice as hard as her male colleagues, knowing that any mistake would be magnified while any success would be minimized. Most importantly, she learned that preparation wasn't just about being ready, it was about being so thoroughly prepared that your opponents couldn't help but respect your competence, even when they refused to respect your presence. Those lessons followed Kamala to Howard University, where she discovered something she'd never experienced before, being surrounded by other brilliant black students who shared her ambitions and understood her struggles. At Howard, she wasn't the diverse face in the room or the exception that proved the rule. She was simply one of many extraordinary young people preparing to change the world. But even at Howard, Kamala's path wasn't typical. While other students focused purely on academics, she was already thinking like a prosecutor. She joined the debate team not just to argue, but to learn how to dismantle opponents' arguments with facts and logic rather than emotion and volume. She studied constitutional law not just to pass tests, but to understand how legal precedents could be weapons in the right hands. Law school at UC Hastings sharpened those instincts into deadly precision. Here, Kamala learned the prosecutor's most valuable skill, how to ask questions that seem innocent on the surface but create inescapable logical traps for anyone foolish enough to lie or dissemble. Her professors noted something unusual about her courtroom simulations: she never raised her voice, never resorted to theatrical gestures, but somehow always managed to make opposing counsel look unprepared and overconfident. Those skills served her well in the Alameda County District Attorney's Office, where she cut her teeth prosecuting career criminals who thought they could charm or intimidate their way out of accountability. Gang leaders who'd never been challenged by anyone, let alone a young black woman, found themselves caught off guard by Harris's methodical approach. She didn't grandstand or speechify. She simply presented facts in sequences that made denial impossible and deflection pointless. When she became San Francisco's district attorney, then California's attorney general, Harris refined her technique against even more sophisticated opponents. Corporate executives who'd never been held accountable for environmental damage suddenly found themselves explaining their actions under oath. Banking officials who thought their lawyers could handle any legal challenge discovered that Harris had done her homework better than their entire legal teams combined. But it was her work taking on predators that revealed Harris's true calling. Whether prosecuting domestic abusers or dismantling human trafficking networks, she brought a focused intensity that seemed almost personal. Because it was personal. Every woman who'd been silenced, every victim who'd been blamed, every survivor who'd been told to move on, Harris carried their voices into every courtroom. Her Senate colleagues learned quickly that underestimating Harris was a career-limiting mistake. During Supreme Court confirmation hearings, she'd sit quietly while other senators grandstand, then ask a series of seemingly simple questions that would expose nominees' evasions and contradictions with surgical precision. Brett Kavanaugh, Amy Coney Barrett, countless cabinet nominees, all discovered that Harris's prosecutorial background wasn't just resume padding. It was a weapon. As vice president, Harris found herself in an unprecedented position. The highest-ranking woman in American history, sitting one heartbeat away from the presidency during one of the most contentious periods in modern American politics. She'd watched democracy itself come under assault, seen women's rights stripped away by judicial fiat, witnessed the rise of politicians who seemed to believe that saying something with confidence was the same as being right. Every morning, she'd receive briefings about the state of American democracy, about voting rights under siege, about women losing access to basic healthcare. Each briefing was a reminder that her mother's lessons about fighting smart had prepared her for this exact moment, when preparation would matter more than performance, when facts would triumph over bluster, when decades of dismantling arrogant men would culminate in a single encounter that could change everything. All of this training, all of this preparation, was about to converge in a single moment that would define both their legacies. The room fell silent after Harris's initial response, but Josh Hawley had spent too many years believing his own press releases to recognize a warning shot when he heard one. He leaned back in his chair with that practiced casualness that screamed Ivy League confidence, adjusted his tie, and flashed the cameras his most disarming smile. In his mind, this was just another opportunity to school a liberal politician on constitutional principles while looking reasonable for the folks back home in Missouri. "Well, Madam Vice President," he began again, his voice carrying that particular tone men use when they're about to explain something they assume you couldn't possibly understand. "I appreciate your passion, but let's focus on the legal realities here. The Supreme Court's decision simply returned this issue to the states, where it constitutionally belongs." Harris didn't interrupt. She simply watched him with the focused intensity of a predator studying its prey. Her pen remained motionless above her notepad. Every camera in the room had zoomed in on her face, capturing the slight narrowing of her eyes that prosecutors recognize as the moment when cross-examination becomes dismantlement. Hawley, oblivious to the shift in atmospheric pressure, pressed forward. "Now, I know emotions are running high on this issue, but we need to separate feelings from constitutional law. The founders never intended." "Senator Hawley," Harris interjected, her voice carrying the weight of courtroom authority, "are you familiar with the Ninth Amendment?" It was a simple question. Deceptively simple. The kind of question that seems innocent until you realize you're standing in quicksand. Hawley's smirk widened. Here was his chance to show off that Yale Law education. "Of course, Madam Vice President. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. But surely you're not suggesting—" "Thank you for that recitation," Harris said, cutting him off with surgical precision. "Now, in your view, do women qualify as people under that amendment?" You could hear a pin drop. Every reporter in the room leaned forward. Congressional staffers stopped shuffling papers. The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Hawley's confidence flickered for just a moment, barely perceptible, but the cameras caught it. His media training kicked in, and he tried to redirect with a patronizing chuckle. "Madam Vice President, that's a rather inflammatory way to phrase the question. Of course women are people, but constitutional interpretation requires more nuance than—" "Senator," Harris interrupted again, her voice steady as a metronome, it's a yes or no question. Do women qualify as people under the Ninth Amendment? The verbal chess match was accelerating now, and Hawley was starting to realize he might be outmatched. But his ego wouldn't let him back down. Instead, he doubled down on the condescension that had served him so well with Missouri voters and conservative donors. I think what you're really asking about is substantive due process, which is a much more complex constitutional doctrine that frankly requires. Senator. Harris's voice cut through his mansplaining like a scalpel through tissue. I was a prosecutor for over a decade before I was a senator. I've probably asked more constitutional questions in actual courtrooms than you've answered in law school seminars. So let me be very clear, do you believe women have constitutional rights that exist independently of state government permission? The room's energy had shifted completely now. What started as Hawley's attempt to lecture the vice president had become something else entirely. Seasoned political observers recognized the moment, this wasn't a debate anymore. This was a prosecutor setting a trap, and the defendant was walking into it with absolute confidence in his own superiority. Hawley's interruptions were growing more frequent now, his explanations more convoluted, his smirk more forced. With each exchange, his body language revealed what his words tried to hide, a growing realization that he had catastrophically underestimated his opponent. Harris, meanwhile, remained laser-focused. Her questions were becoming more precise, her follow-ups more devastating. Every answer Hawley gave only tightened the logical noose she was methodically placing around his arguments. And then Hawley made the fatal mistake that would haunt him forever. Hawley leaned forward with that trademark smirk, the one that had intimidated countless opponents over the years, and delivered what he thought would be his knockout punch. Madam Vice President, with all due respect, I think you're confusing political talking points with actual constitutional scholarship. The reality is that nowhere in the Constitution does it explicitly guarantee a right to abortion, and frankly, I'm surprised that someone in your position would argue otherwise. Perhaps you should leave the constitutional interpretation to those of us who've actually clerked for the Supreme Court. The silence that followed was deafening. Harris set down her pen with deliberate precision. She looked up from her notes, and for a moment, just a moment, something flickered across her face that made every prosecutor in America lean forward in recognition. It was the look of someone who had just been handed exactly the opening they'd been waiting for. Senator Hawley, she began, her voice carrying the quiet authority of 20 years in courtrooms, since you've raised the issue of constitutional scholarship, let me ask you this, are you familiar with Griswold v. Connecticut? Hawley's confidence wavered slightly, but he pressed on. Of course. The 1965 case about contraception access for married couples. But that's hardly. And Eisenstadt versus Baird. The extension to unmarried couples, yes, but. Lawrence versus Texas. Same-sex intimate relationships, but I don't see how. Loving versus Virginia. Now Hawley was visibly uncomfortable. The rapid-fire questioning was forcing him into a corner he hadn't seen coming. Interracial marriage, obviously, but Madam Vice President, these cases are hardly analogous to. Harris raised her hand, and the room fell silent again. Senator, every single case I just mentioned was decided on the same constitutional principle that you claim doesn't exist. The fundamental right to privacy. The right to make intimate decisions about one's own body and life without government interference. The Ninth Amendment you so eloquently recited protects unenumerated rights, rights that exist whether or not they're explicitly written in the Constitution. She paused, letting that sink in. Every camera in the room was trained on Hawley's face as the color began to drain from it. Now, Senator, since you've raised your Supreme Court clerkship as a credential, surely you remember that in each of these cases, the court found that certain decisions, about contraception, about marriage, about intimate relationships, are so fundamental to human dignity that they cannot be subject to majority vote or state-by-state variation. Would you agree? Hawley tried to recover. Well, those cases involved different circumstances. Different how? Harris's voice was surgical now. Because they involved men's rights too. The question landed like a thunderclap. You could hear the collective intake of breath from the gallery. Reporters were frantically typing. Congressional staffers exchanged wide-eyed glances. Hawley stammered, "That's not, I never said." "Senator, let me read you something." Harris picked up a document from her desk. "This is from your own 2018 Senate campaign website, where you explicitly stated that government has no business interfering in the private medical decisions between patients and doctors. You said, and I quote, healthcare decisions should be made by individuals and their physicians, not by government bureaucrats. Do you remember writing that?" Hawley's smirk was completely gone now. "That was in the context of." "Of what, Senator?" "Of men's healthcare. Because according to your voting record, you've consistently opposed government interference in healthcare decisions, except when those decisions are made by women about their own reproductive health. Can you explain that distinction?" The trap was fully sprung now, and everyone in the room could see it. Hawley's carefully constructed constitutional arguments were crumbling under the weight of his own contradictions. Furthermore, Harris continued, her voice rising with controlled passion, "You mentioned my position. Let me be very clear about my position. I believe that women are full citizens of this republic. I believe that women have the same constitutional rights as men. And I believe that a government that can force a woman to carry a pregnancy to term against her can force any of us to do anything it wants with our bodies." She stood up now, her full prosecutorial presence filling the room. "Senator, you clerked for Chief Justice Roberts, so surely you remember the principle of substantive due process, the idea that certain rights are so fundamental that no government, state or federal, can violate them. The right to marry who you love. The right to raise your children as you see fit. The right to use contraception. The right to make intimate decisions about your own body. These aren't liberal talking points, Senator. These are constitutional principles that have guided American jurisprudence for over half a century." Hawley made one last desperate attempt. "But the court has clearly stated." "The court," Harris said, her voice now carrying the full weight of history, "has also stated that separate is inherently unequal, that women cannot be excluded from practicing law, and that loving someone of the same sex is not a crime. The court has been wrong before, Senator, and when it strips away fundamental rights from half the population, it is wrong again." She leaned forward, her eyes locked on Hawley's increasingly uncomfortable face. "And Senator, since you seem so concerned with constitutional originalism, let me remind you that the 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection under the law. Not equal protection for men. Not equal protection for some people. Equal protection under the law. When government treats women as second-class citizens whose most intimate decisions are subject to political control, it violates that fundamental promise." The room was completely silent now. Hawley sat deflated in his chair, his Yale Law confidence evaporated, his Supreme Court clerkship reduced to a footnote in his own humiliation. Harris had systematically dismantled not just his arguments, but the entire intellectual framework he'd used to justify treating women as less than full citizens. The moment stretched, and then Harris delivered the final blow. "The Constitution protects all of us, Senator. Even women." But the real fireworks were just beginning. Within 60 seconds of Harris's final words, the internet exploded. The clip hadn't even finished airing on C-SPAN when Twitter users were already sharing screen recordings with captions like, "Prosecution 101" and "How to Dismantle a Mansplainer in Real Time." The hashtag Senator I'm Speaking began trending before the hearing had even recessed, climbing past hashtag Kamala destroyed him and hashtag constitutional scholarship my ass in the race to capture America's collective reaction. TikTok creators were working at lightning speed. Within 2 hours, there were compilation videos set to dramatic music showing Hawley's smirk dissolving frame by frame as Harris systematically dismantled his arguments. One particularly viral video juxtaposed Hawley's confident opening statements with his deflated final moments, set to the Curb Your Enthusiasm theme song. It gained 3 million views in 4 hours. The memes were merciless and immediate. Hawley's expression of dawning horror became the internet's new favorite reaction image. When you try to mansplain constitutional law to a former prosecutor, appeared over screenshots of his increasingly panicked face. POV, you just realized you brought a law school essay to a courtroom fight, accompanied slow-motion captures of his visible deflation. Instagram stories from celebrities started flooding in almost immediately. Reese Witherspoon posted a video of herself applauding with the caption, "This is how you defend women's rights." Oprah shared the clip with a simple but powerful message, "Excellence recognizes excellence." Kerry Washington, who had played a prosecutor on Scandal, posted a side-by-side comparison of her fictional courtroom scenes with Harris's real-life takedown, writing, "The real thing hits different." The political reactions were swift and telling. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted within minutes, "This is what happens when preparation meets privilege. Every law student in America should study this exchange." Elizabeth Warren shared the clip with the comment, 20 years as a prosecutor. It shows. Even some Republican women quietly liked posts praising Harris's performance, though none dared to comment publicly. Legal experts were having a field day on cable news. Harvard Law professor Lawrence Tribe appeared on CNN within hours, calling it one of the most effective pieces of constitutional advocacy I've seen in a Senate hearing. Former federal prosecutor Joyce Vance tweeted a thread breaking down Harris's questioning technique, "This is textbook prosecutorial cross-examination. Notice how each question builds on the last, creating an inescapable logical trap." But it was the reaction from ordinary women that truly captured the cultural moment. Facebook groups dedicated to supporting working mothers exploded with comments from women sharing their own experiences with workplace mansplaining. "I've been in that room," wrote one corporate lawyer. "I know exactly how it feels when a man assumes you don't understand your own expertise." Watching Harris handle it with such grace and power was healing. The women's rights organization seized the moment immediately. Planned Parenthood's social media team created an infographic breaking down Harris's constitutional arguments, which was shared over 100,000 times in the first day. Emily's List raised $2.3 million in small donations within 48 hours, with the average contribution being $47, a not-so-subtle reference to the length of the viral exchange. International media picked up the story too. The BBC ran a segment on "The American Vice President's Viral Moment," while French newspaper Le Monde called it a masterclass in political discourse. German talk shows dissected the clip as an example of how American women were fighting back against authoritarian overreach. The numbers were staggering. The original C-SPAN footage gained 12 million views across all platforms within 24 hours. Shortened versions and commentary videos pushed the total engagement to over 50 million interactions. #Senator I'm Speaking became the #1 trending topic worldwide, staying there for 3 consecutive days. Late-night comedians had a field day. Stephen Colbert devoted his entire opening monologue to the exchange, complete with slow-motion replays of Hawley's facial expressions. Saturday Night Live called an emergency writers' meeting to incorporate the moment into that weekend's cold open. But perhaps the most powerful reactions came from young women across America. High school debate teams were already studying the exchange. College pre-law students were sharing clips in their group chats with messages like, "This is why I want to be a prosecutor." A 16-year-old from Ohio summed up what millions were feeling when she posted on TikTok, "I've never seen a woman dismantle a man's arrogance so completely while maintaining such dignity. I want to be her when I grow up." The clip became more than viral content, it became a cultural touchstone. A moment when millions of Americans saw what it looked like when expertise triumphed over entitlement, when preparation defeated privilege, when a woman refused to be diminished by a man's condescension. But beyond the viral fame, something deeper was happening to the American consciousness. In the days that followed, as the viral storm continued to rage across social media and cable news, something remarkable began to emerge from the chaos. What had started as a political confrontation was transforming into something much more profound, a moment that spoke to the deepest truths about power, respect, and what it means to be heard in America. Harris herself seemed to understand this transformation. In interviews following the hearing, she didn't gloat or celebrate her viral moment. Instead, she did what great leaders do, she reframed the entire exchange around principles that transcended party lines and political theater. This wasn't about winning a debate, she told reporters gathered outside the Capitol. This was about defending the fundamental principle that women are full citizens of this republic, with constitutional rights that cannot be voted away by politicians who think they know better than we do about our own lives and bodies. But her message went deeper than reproductive rights or even women's issues. This was about something that every American could recognize and respect, the power of preparation over performance, expertise over entitlement, substance over style. Think about what millions of viewers had actually witnessed in that hearing room. They hadn't just seen a politician score points against an opponent. They had watched decades of preparation meet a moment of truth. Every case Harris had prosecuted, every cross-examination she had conducted, every night she had spent studying constitutional law, all of it had led to those few minutes when she calmly and systematically dismantled an opponent's arrogance with nothing but facts, logic, and unshakable dignity. This resonated far beyond partisan politics. Conservative women who disagreed with Harris on policy still found themselves admiring her composure under fire. Independent voters who had grown tired of political theater appreciated seeing someone who actually knew what they were talking about. Even some Republican men privately admitted that watching Hawley's condescension get exposed was deeply satisfying. The broader lesson was unmistakable: preparation beats privilege every time. Harris hadn't won that exchange because she was louder or more charismatic than Hawley. She had won because she had done her homework while he had relied on assumptions and entitlement. She knew constitutional law better than he did. She understood prosecutorial technique better than he did. She had prepared for that moment her entire career while he had assumed his credentials would carry the day. For millions of women watching, this felt like validation for every time they had been told to speak up less, every meeting where they had been interrupted, every moment when a man had assumed he understood their experiences better than they did. Harris had shown them what it looked like to refuse that diminishment with grace, intelligence, and devastating effectiveness. But the lesson extended even further than gender dynamics. In an era when political discourse had devolved into sound bites and social media attacks, Harris had demonstrated the enduring power of actual expertise. She hadn't resorted to personal attacks or inflammatory rhetoric. She had simply used facts, precedent, and logical reasoning to expose the contradictions in her opponent's position. In a time when many Americans had given up on the possibility of substantive political discourse, she had reminded them what it looked like when someone actually knew what they were talking about. The ripple effects were already visible across American culture. Law schools reported increased applications from young women inspired by Harris's performance. High school debate coaches were incorporating the exchange into their curricula as an example of effective argumentation. Corporate diversity trainers were using clips from the hearing to illustrate what respectful but firm pushback against workplace condescension could look like. More importantly, the moment had restored something that many Americans thought they had lost: the belief that truth could still triumph over bluster, that expertise could still defeat entitlement, that dignity could still overcome arrogance. In a political environment where facts often seemed optional and preparation was frequently dismissed as weakness, Harris had proven that substance still mattered. The constitutional principles she had defended were important, but the way she had defended them was transformative. She had shown that you could be fierce without being mean, powerful without being loud, victorious without being vindictive. And that's why this moment will be remembered long after both senators are gone. So there you have it, Kamala Harris versus Josh Hawley, a clash on women's rights that went viral not because of political theater or manufactured drama, but because millions of Americans witnessed something they had been hungry to see for years: the moment when preparation meets arrogance and wins. This wasn't just about reproductive rights or constitutional law, though those issues matter deeply. This was about something more fundamental: the moment when someone finally said what everyone was thinking, when expertise defeated entitlement, when dignity triumphed over condescension with nothing but facts, logic, and unshakable composure. In an era when political discourse often feels hopeless, when expertise is dismissed and preparation is mocked, Harris reminded us that substance still matters. She showed us what real leadership looks like: not loud, not performative, not designed for social media clips, but rooted in decades of hard work, deep knowledge, and genuine respect for the institutions she was defending. That's why this moment resonated across party lines. That's why it inspired millions of young women to see themselves in positions of power. That's why it reminded all of us that democracy works best when it's populated by people who have actually done the work to understand the issues they're debating. But here's the thing, moments like these only matter if we're paying attention. If we're engaged. If we're holding our elected officials accountable for bringing this same level of preparation and integrity to every debate, every hearing, every decision that affects our lives. If this video reminded you why expertise matters, why preparation beats privilege, and why dignity always defeats arrogance in the end, then subscribe for more moments of real political accountability. Share this with someone who needs to see what authentic leadership looks like in action. Most importantly, stay engaged. Vote in every election. Demand this level of competence from everyone who asks for your trust. Because democracy doesn't work on autopilot, it works when people like you decide it's worth defending. The Constitution protects all of us. Even women. Especially women. And that's a truth worth fighting for.